Welcome to the webinar, Meeting Data Center Demand with Low Carbon Power. My name is Mukunda Kaushik, Senior Analyst at Lux Research, and I'll be moderating today's session. Presenting are my colleagues Chloe Herrera and Anirudh Bhupalam, analysts here at Lux Research. Throughout this webinar, you can type any questions you have in the questions box on your screen. Time permitting, we'll get to all of your questions. If your question doesn't get answered, please don't hesitate to email it to questions@luxresearchinc.com and we'll respond to you. If at any point you experience technical difficulties such as a frozen screen, simply refresh your browser and check that your internet connection is strong. But other than that, let's jump into the presentation. So over to you, Chloe and Anirudh.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. So first, in order to understand load growth of the future, we thought it would make sense to see how it was handled in the past. So we dug up some data to see how electricity consumption has evolved in the past. And surprisingly, it hasn't risen that much in the last 20 years. It hasn't really skyrocketed after the 60s, 70s, and the 80s. And one of the biggest reasons behind this was efficiency improvements because of various efficiency improvements in appliances, etc. And the biggest one was the LED light bulb. So the LED light bulb consumes about 90% less energy than an incandescent bulb and lasts for about 25 times longer. And they've been adopted aggressively. So in 2012, roughly 9% of commercial buildings reported using LED light bulbs, while in 2018, that shot up to 44%. And now LED light bulbs are the default option. So they played a huge role in curtailing load growth. But today, this LED light bulb's savior role is starting to come to an end. We're now seeing electricity demand rise from various sectors, and the LED light bulb or any other similar innovation isn't going to save the day. For example, the transport sector's electricity demand went up by a factor of 2 in the 5 years from 2020 to 2025, and it's expected to rise 6-fold by 2050. Data center demand went up by about 50% in the same period, the last 5 years, and will grow further even in the short term, especially with the recent explosion of AI. So there are certain scenarios for load growth, as with anything future related, but that the load growth will happen is undeniable. And this has shown itself even in the last couple of years. So in 2024, global electricity demand grew by 4.3%, which was significantly higher than the 2.5% the year before. And between 2010 and 2023, electricity demand grew by 2.7% on average per year. And this was double the rate of energy demand growth in the same period. So this growth poses a challenge to the utilities and therefore grid. So today, in this presentation, we're going to discuss the range of challenges that utilities face in this changing grid landscape. Second, we'll talk about a strategy to meet the rising electricity needs while also maintaining reliability. And finally, we will chart an electrification pathway that also incorporates low carbon power. So let's get right into it.
And so when we think about the increase in energy demand, we of course need to put utilities at the center of that conversation. But this isn't the only thing that utilities have to think about. They juggle a multitude of different challenges when thinking about the evolving grid. First is infrastructure management. So no matter where in the value chain these utilities sit, they have to worry about different forms of infrastructure within their service area. And we see that this is already becoming a challenge for utilities. In the US, for example, we saw an explosion of interconnection requests starting in about 2020. And most of these requests are renewables projects, solar and wind. But utilities are having a really hard time keeping up with all of this new capacity requested to go live on the grid. In order to address this, the federal Energy Regulatory Commission put out a regulation that these capacity expansions needed to happen by July 2025. And actually all ISOs in the US have said that they would not be able to meet this deadline. In fact, California, for example, expects that they won't be able to address this until 2027 at the earliest, because not only are they dealing with capacity expansion, but they're also dealing with aging infrastructure, natural disasters that can impact their infrastructure, and the like. Next up, utilities have to worry about new electricity loads, which is what we're going to be talking about a lot for the majority of this presentation. But it's not just data center demand for AI. We're seeing that in the transport sector, electric mobility is really going to be the way of the future. And you can expect that for medium and heavy duty vehicles, these megawatt charging systems are going to become the norm, where you can expect up to 10 megawatts of fresh new demand at these charging stations. And oftentimes they're in remote areas, or they could be even larger for private fleets, and utilities need to be able to address this demand. Then is the electrification of industry. As industry looks towards decarbonization, electrification is really one of the more efficient ways to do so. And so if you think about electrifying steel making, the electric arc furnace, a small one that can address the needs of a medium steel plant, can add about 18 megawatts of new load to the grid. This requires new grid upgrades to the substation nearby, as well as increasing its capacity at the connection of the site. And then finally, data centers. Now, 250 megawatts is probably a bit more extreme case. They can be 80 megawatts, up to 250 megawatts. But these are completely new pieces of load that utilities are seeing. They're seeing these requests for AI data centers, and it's unlikely to slow down. And then the final challenge that utilities are juggling is decarbonization. So their customers are, of course, looking to decarbonize, and they're turning towards electrification to do so. But if you can only truly decarbonize your operations if that electricity is also zero or low carbon. And utilities are having to deal with a ton of new power generation options, more distributed generation, and generation that needs a combination of solar plus storage, wind plus storage, et cetera. And utilities have to learn how to coordinate these new power generating options. But utilities aren't the only ones that are struggling with this.
Yeah, with all of these challenges, it's unsurprising that they find it hard to serve requests. So for instance, we spoke to a beverage company that was installing charging stations, and they mentioned that they faced up to delays of up to a year, even when all the behind-the-meter construction was complete. And they noted that this was largely because of a lack of experience from the utility in some regions. In some other regions where utilities were a bit more experienced, the process was much smoother, and they were able to bring the charging infrastructure online much quicker. So we can sort of generalize this and say that utilities and customers must collaborate on their electrification strategies. It's no longer a mostly one-way process where a customer requests a connection. There are new loads popping up everywhere. There's more behind-the-meter generation. So collaboration could benefit the whole system as a whole and avoid delays. And that said, we'll now talk about how they can collaborate together and how a utility can use a strategy to meet rising electricity needs while maintaining reliability.
And so if you're in the audience and you're not necessarily a utility, this is still going to be very important to understand. Important to understand their challenges that they're facing and how they're going to solve this challenge of load growth. Because if at the end of the day, you're not able to get that electricity, your operations are going to suffer as well. And so at Lux, we created this framework to evaluate this load growth. And we defined new loads with 3 attributes. The first is the magnitude of demand. And this is not going to be global load growth or regional load growth forecast. It's more so if a utility is going to see a new customer, what is that new requested grid connection going to look like? This is going to be a very case-by-case basis depending on the load. Second is, how urgent is this load? Is this going to be adopted more towards 2030, or is it longer term, like 2050? And in addition to the adoption timeline, how likely is it that the customer, the user, is going to adopt that technology to electrify? And then finally is, what is the load management potential of this load? So how flexible is it if the utility wants it to participate in demand response, for example? And then also, how predictable is it? How well can the utility prepare for the electricity demand on a day-by-day, week-by-week, or year-by-year basis? And once you have all of these attributes, you can then start to think about how to create strategies for these new loads. And so we've created 4 different strategies based on both the urgency and load management potential, where for the lower urgency but higher flexibility loads, this is a really great space for utilities to partner with energy engineering services to potentially create their own business units and partner with their customers on building out solutions to power operations. But for higher urgency applications where you get a little bit more load management potential, this is really the low-hanging fruit. This is where utilities should be active right now in engaging with their customers proactively and finding out new ways to manage this demand. But then for those loads that are a little bit lower flexibility, if they're lower urgency, utilities really need to be monitoring this space, especially for industrial electrification, where it might seem a bit daunting because there's a lot of electricity demand when you're electrifying steel or cement, et cetera. But there's a lot of technology pathways that are available within these industries that utilities need to be familiar with. And then finally, for higher urgency technologies or applications that have low load management potential, that's a really good opportunity for piloting and for utilities to really put their best foot forward as innovators and engage with these customers and attract new customers while also understanding how to handle these new loads. And it's all nice and good to talk about these strategies, but we want to make it more concrete. And so to do so, we're going to look at data centers. And when we look at data centers, first, the magnitude of demand is about 250 megawatts for a pretty large scale AI data center. And in terms of urgency, very high. It's a technology that is available now. These data centers are being deployed today, and utilities are seeing this demand right now.
So let's look at some numbers around the urgency. So looking at IEA projections, data center demand in the US is expected to increase to 260 terawatt hours by 2026, which is a 60 terawatt hour increase in 4 years. And we're expecting to see similar ranges of increases across other regions as well. A lot of this is coming from AI, which is being adopted rapidly by both businesses and consumers alike. And because of this, we're seeing more power-hungry chips being deployed, with 30-plus kilowatt server racks becoming common. And by 2030, we can also expect to see 100-plus kilowatt rack servers.
And then looking at load management potential, we rated this a moderate because, first of all, there is some potential flexibility in the loads. It really depends on the data center. And the data centers, some data centers also have pretty predictable loads. If they have an idea of when and where their computation takes place most often, and based on weather patterns, they can predict pretty well what their cooling demand is going to be.
So with regards to load management potential or flexibility, we've heard both sides of the story. So we've seen the likes of Glovo carry out some pilot where they move non-urgent computing load across space and time. This is part of their carbon intelligent computing platform, as they call it. So when there's more renewable capacity available somewhere, they move computing demand there, and they move computing demand across time when requested by, let's say, a grid operator. And they also provide demand response. However, we've also heard from industry stakeholders that this is not very easy or not very widely implemented, especially outside the hyperscalers. If we think of co-location data centers, they serve multiple customers and they simply cannot move the compute capacity of one customer to another because of privacy reasons, contractual issues, etc.
And so putting this all together, we can place data centers on this framework. And we can see that it kind of sits in the middle between utilities proactively engaging with their customers if the load management potential is higher. And then for the ones that are a little bit lower, utilities should really pilot new electrification strategies with their customers. And I've also placed here the steel electric arc furnace and megawatt charging stations just to understand how these other loads look. And so then we're left with the question, what is the best way to power these data centers now that we know some of the strategies utilities can employ?
And we're going to use the US as an example here. And when we talk about powering data centers in the US, developers tend to go straight to natural gas. Multiple industry stakeholders have echoed this sentiment. And this is because of how developed the gas grid can be. Also in the US, gas is relatively cheap and can be a reliable source of power. So it's not really surprising that we're seeing big players announce deals around natural gas. For example, big oil majors like ExxonMobil and Chevron have both announced natural gas capacity for data centers. ExxonMobil is planning 1.5 gigawatts of capacity, while Chevron is planning for 4 gigawatts. Both of them also mention carbon capture in the future to make it a lower carbon source of power. Vantage also announced a partnership with VoltaGrid, where the latter will deploy about 1 gigawatt of gas power for data centers from Vantage's North American data centers. Well, with all this activity around natural gas, we also wanted to explore how it economically compares to other options. And for this, we built models to probabilistically assess systems resource adequacy in meeting data center reliability and calculate levelized costs of electricity. Here, I will note that the LCOE figures that I'm about to present are values for delivering electricity to a data center at a reliability level, at the required reliability level, which for a Tier 4 data center is a maximum of 26 minutes downtime in a year. So looking at some results, first, we look at LCOE for natural gas. This is computed as a benchmark. Next, we'll see some values for geothermal and nuclear. So the instant observation is that they are much higher and exhibit a good degree of variation. They are higher because of the higher capex costs, and the variation comes from scaling effects as the size goes up. Despite these high costs, we've seen considerable activity among data center operators in announcing deals for geothermal and nuclear because they have long-term potential, and data center operators are typically willing to pay premiums. For example, CH Geosystems will install an enhanced geothermal system to provide 150 megawatts to power Meta's data centers. They did not give out any details around location or timeline, which is characteristic of the geothermal space's delays. We've also seen nuclear announcements from the likes of Google, Amazon, Microsoft. Google, for instance, has partnered with Kairos Power for 500 megawatts of nuclear power by 2035, with the first SMR, small modular reactor, slated to go online by 2030. Next, we look at fuel cells, both with natural gas and hydrogen. Here, there's not much of variation in costs because fuel cells do not really exhibit a scaling effect. As expected, the LCOE of using hydrogen is really high because of how high current estimated costs of green hydrogen are. This could change in the future, but our analysis also showed that some other industries like trucking would be willing to absorb these costs much sooner than data centers. That is, their tipping points are much higher. Fuel cells with natural gas could potentially be an option, but they do face challenges associated with finding maintenance personnel and also high startup times, for instance. So therefore, they're more suited to backup power options, especially when paired with batteries. We have seen examples of deployments of fuel cells as well, especially from the likes of Bloom Energy. When it comes to hydrogen fuel cells, Microsoft is one of the early movers in the area, testing fuel cells for backup power, both in the US, in Wyoming, for instance, and Europe, in Dublin. However, again, the cost of hydrogen makes fuel cells for data centers highly uneconomical.
Finally, we look at solar and wind. And when looking at both of these, we see that it has the most competitive LCOE with natural gas, but these generation assets still require a grid connection. So when looking at wind, it has a grid reliance of about 20%, while solar requires about 45% to keep up those high reliability requirements. If you combine solar and wind, you only combine grid reliance by about 3 or 4%. And we're seeing a lot of activity in this space. First with the 200 megawatt solar PPA in Texas by Meta. And we're also seeing the first onshore wind power in Virginia for about 80 megawatts. But like I mentioned, we do need a grid connection for solar and wind because data center downtime is very costly. About 63% of outages in data centers required $100,000 in losses. And then 15% of those outages were about greater than $1 million in losses. And electricity reliability is one of the leading reasons for outages. About 43% of data center outages were caused by a lack of electricity reliability.
With this requirement for reliability, we are seeing microgrids emerge. We've also heard conversations where the microgrid builder and the utility agree for quicker interconnection to the grid in return for grid services. We're also seeing a lot of natural gas microgrids from the likes of Enchanted Rock. A notable solar plus storage microgrid is Tencent in Tianjin, China, with 10.54 megawatt of solar with unspecified storage that's also used for providing grid services. The company is also installing solar panels at several of its other data centers and recently also unveiled a microgrid in a data center in Huali in China. Google has also announced partnerships with Insect Power and TPG Rice Climate to co-locate data centers and renewables. This is a longer-term partnership where Intersect Power is pumping in billions of dollars to set up solar generation assets to power Google's data centers. Now, when we talk about microgrids, we again run into the topic of flexibility, which we did discuss earlier in the presentation. A couple of companies are active in this, as we mentioned, but industry stakeholders did mention it is not widespread. That being said, the appetite to achieve something in this regard is really high, and this is evident from the DC Flex Foundation. So this has several key stakeholders like hyperscalers, chip manufacturers, utilities, etc., and they want to carry out pilots in 5 to 10 flexibility hubs by 2027. It does remain to be seen what they can achieve because a data center's main goal is still to be reduced. Is still to reduce downtime. So with that, we now arrive at the final part of this webinar where we chart a longer-term electrification pathway that also incorporates low-carbon power.
And we've explored the data center application quite extensively, but we expect to see a lot of new sources of demand. When we look at both transport, when we look at the transport sector, industrial sector, and the heat sector, there's quite a lot of opportunities for utilities to engage with customers and help power their operations. Now, with these applications in the upper right-hand quadrant, like I mentioned, these are really going to be low-hanging fruit. This is, if you're a customer with these applications, it's a great opportunity to look for innovative utilities. If you are an innovative utility, it's a great opportunity to engage with customers that need this kind of power. But for these less urgent loads, it's really important to get in early, both for the utility and the customer, because for really large loads, especially in the industrial sector, it's going to require a lot of long-term planning. Utilities will need to either partner with their customers to build out energy engineering services, or partner with other power service providers to be able to meet their electricity demand. And then in kind of these newer technologies, it's really important that utilities monitor where these technology developments are happening to understand which pathway is most likely to develop and hit their service area.
So let's come back to a utilities grid needs that we saw earlier and present solutions on how to solve these. So with new electricity loads, the solution would be to use natural gas plus CCS. We saw, at least from a data center perspective, that natural gas and CCS presented the cheaper option, lower carbon option, especially when CCS is involved and many oil and gas majors are looking to get involved, and that presents a short-term option. When we talk about decarbonization, we look at solar and wind. Solar and wind PPAs are being signed. They provide cheap electrons, and this will only continue. Support either in the form of a grid connection or storage. Solar and wind will help with decarbonization, and it will keep continuing. And when we talk about infrastructure management, microgrids are a promising solution. Microgrids can help relieve pressure on the grid. They can also help a utility bring electricity to newer neighborhoods much quicker at a lower cost, and also defer grid infrastructure improvements. Alongside all of this, it is also important to look at more baseload power options, or your geothermal, nuclear, etc. They're currently expensive, but in the longer term, they will undoubtedly play a big role. And the data center industry provides a good example with lots of interest from the hyperscalers. And finally, it is also important to monitor demand-side innovation. So the LED light bulb is not going to save the day, but there are innovations, for instance, in chip design, data center cooling, talking about the data center space, which will help eat away a slight chunk of the demand. And that's important to monitor.
And so, like we mentioned, it's really important to understand how these electrification routes are happening for utilities customers, because that will help them determine their strategy. As utilities grapple with all of those challenges, they need to be able to power up all of these new loads. And we'll leave you with 3 key takeaways here. The first is that net new demand is going to happen. We're not going to see a lot of savings from efficiency gains, and we expect to see about 30% energy demand growth in the next 35 years. The second is that utilities really need to be able to anticipate their customer needs and have a strategy for how their customers are going to electrify. This is non-uniform across sectors. No 2 customers with different applications will have the same electrification needs, and it's increasingly important that utilities can understand how those will differ. And then third, look at behind the meter generation, because there is a lot of potential for growth here, primarily because there's a mismatch between what is needed by customers and then also what is available from the grid. And so in order to not lose out, utilities should really be exploring how to get in behind the meter, and customers should also be exploring new generation options from behind the meter. And with that, thank you, and we're happy to take some questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Chloe and Anirudh. We do have quite a lot of questions coming in the chat, so I'll pick a few. Starting with, how can developers ease local pushback against data centers? You know, whether that's something like water usage or just the not in my backyard sentiment.
Yeah, that's a great question, because we're constantly seeing articles about the NIMBYism related to data centers, and this was one of the problems or issues mentioned to us by an industry stakeholder that we spoke to, that a lot of data center developers tend to neglect community engagement. They talk a lot about technology, etc., but they don't engage with communities, and that kills projects. And that data center industry stakeholder mentioned that it's often a case-by-case basis. So typically, you can do things like provide some internet access or free water, free electricity to people in the area. But they also did mention some more unconventional approaches, like in some cases, using the extra heat to dry coffee beans. They also mentioned an example in the UK where the data center developer got involved and set up a football league because the local area was just filled with a very football intensive crowd. So it's a case-by-case basis. It's on a case-by-case basis, but I guess the ultimate takeaway is that you actually talk and engage with the community and not just leave them out in any discussions.
Okay. Second question is on regulations, right? So how are data center operators preparing to deal with related regulations if they don't have a tool that they can quickly use to check?
Yeah, this is something that was actually quite a topic of discussion at a conference I went to last year. And one of the presenters said the exact same thing, because the European Union is introducing the EED, the Energy Efficiency Directive for data centers, where data centers are having to start reporting emissions. And what they did say was that it's been quite difficult because there's no official software or anything that they can simply just buy and use to calculate emissions. So as of now, from what I'm aware, they're still sort of learning how to do it, and there's sort of a gap in the market in that sense for some kind of a software that can quickly tell them how to do it. But doesn't seem like there's a one-stop solution right away. So as regulations evolve in the EU, for instance, we will likely start seeing emissions caps at some point. We might see some regulations pop up in the US as well. So as they evolve, we will likely see some solutions also pop up. So now it's mostly exploring from their part.
I think we have time for one more question. We pick up a technology-driven one. You spoke about CCS gas and to challenging to implement, right? So can large energy storage, for example, fill the gap to support
So I think that when thinking about using renewables for data centers, you can't leave energy storage out of that discussion. So like I mentioned, it's when thinking about the LCOE that we presented, there is that grid reliance that they have. And you can utilize energy storage to really bring down that need for grid connection. Otherwise, if you want to eliminate your grid connection, you're left with either oversizing your renewables system or depending on storage. And data centers, I would say they have kind of two storage needs. The first is in the uninterruptible power supply part, and we're seeing a lot of lithium ion there. But when we start thinking about more behind the meter generation, yes, there's a huge need for 4-hour, 8-hour, maybe even 24-hour energy storage to keep those reliability requirements.
Okay, thank you, Chloe and Anirudh. That concludes our webinar for today. The presentation and the recording from this webinar will be sent to all email. After leaving the webinar, you'll be prompted to complete a survey on today's presentation, and we would appreciate any feedback that can help inform and improve our future webinars. Take a moment on the screen and look at our upcoming webinars. Otherwise, have a great day. I'll see you soon.